In a small, dimly lit apartment, the weight of the world rests on a single father's shoulders. Bills are stacked on the kitchen table like silent warnings, eviction notices staring back like accusing eyes. A fridge hums in the background, nearly empty, while scattered toys on the floor tell a story of children trying to grow up too fast in a place that feels like it's closing in. Every corner of the room seems to echo the strain of survival, a reminder that life rarely pauses for those who are struggling. Jamal has been carrying the weight of his family for years. Every day he wakes before dawn, working long, grueling hours that barely cover rent. Every night, he returns home exhausted, knowing the demands of a world that doesn't bend in his favor. He's built a life on sacrifice, yet the system keeps pushing back, relentless and unforgiving. And now, in this small apartment, he faces what may be the greatest threat of all: losing the roof over his children's heads. The papers on the table are unyielding. Notices of late rent. Threats of eviction. Reminders that the world doesn't pause for the hardworking or the good-hearted. Each one carries the same quiet menace: the possibility of failure, the fear that no matter how much you give, it may never be enough. Around him, signs of life continue, indifferent to the struggle unfolding within these walls. Cars pass on the street outside, their headlights cutting through the night like fleeting hope. Neon signs flicker in distant windows, cheerful advertisements mocking the somber reality within. Somewhere nearby, laughter drifts through the city air, a reminder that the world moves forward even as Jamal feels frozen, trapped in a cycle of worry and exhaustion. The apartment itself tells a story. The couch sags under the weight of long nights and restless sleep. A single slice of bread and a nearly empty bottle of juice sit on a kitchen counter, the remnants of a day stretched too thin. Children's drawings cling to the walls, bright colors fighting to pierce the gloom, innocent attempts at joy in a space shadowed by hardship. It is a home, but it is also a battlefield, and the father standing in its center is engaged in a war without end. Every fiber of Jamal's being has been tested. His hands, calloused from years of labor, carry the invisible weight of responsibility, of hopes and dreams deferred, of promises made to children he adores. The exhaustion is not just physical. It is emotional, a quiet erosion that threatens to undo the foundation he has fought so hard to maintain. Yet, even as the burden presses down, he has held fast to a flicker of resilience. Every morning he rises, every night he returns, and every small act of care he performs for his children is a declaration that he will not give up, even when the world seems determined to push him to his knees. The fight is silent, unseen, yet it defines him. Outside, the city hums, oblivious to the struggle within. And yet, there is a whisper of something stirring, an echo on the wind, the distant rumble of engines on the horizon. It is faint at first, almost lost in the symphony of life passing by. But it carries a promise, that sometimes when hope seems gone, help can come from the most unexpected places, in forms that defy expectation and challenge the judgment of appearances. Jamal sits alone amidst the papers and the clutter, the weight of impending loss pressing down on him. His children's laughter, muffled and fragile, filters through the apartment, a reminder of what is at stake. The world outside remains indifferent, yet a story is about to unfold that will change the trajectory of a family, revealing the power of kindness, courage, and humanity in the places least expected. For now, he does not know that salvation is approaching. He does not know that a group of people, judged by many for their rough exteriors, will soon step into his life and alter the course of his story forever. The rumble of motorcycles grows, distant but insistent, like a heartbeat against the despair, heralding a shift in fortune, a glimmer of hope in a life teetering on the edge. And in this quiet, heavy moment, the truth hangs in the air. Jamal is about to face the fight of his life. Not alone, but with strangers whose hearts are far kinder than appearances suggest. The story of struggle is about to meet the story of unexpected salvation. Long before the eviction notice lay like a shadow on the kitchen table, Jamal's life had been defined by struggle and perseverance. The streets he grew up on were unforgiving, lined with buildings whose bricks had absorbed generations of hardship. In his youth, he had seen friends and neighbors fall victim to the harshness of a world that often punished good intentions and hard work alike. Every day had been a lesson in resilience, in learning to carry weight that no child should bear, and in discovering that survival demanded more than courage, it demanded sacrifice. Jamal had been a dreamer, but reality had always intervened. The promise of opportunities often came with hidden obstacles, doors that seemed open only to close in quiet cruelty. Even his education, a source of pride and hope, had been marred by the subtle and relentless pressures of inequality. Teachers had overlooked him, counselors had doubted him, and systems built to nurture potential seemed designed to test endurance instead. Yet Jamal persevered, navigating the narrow corridors between hope and disappointment with a determination that would define the rest of his life. Adulthood had brought its own trials. Jamal worked long hours at a factory, each day a monotonous rhythm of labor that left his body aching and his mind exhausted. The pay was barely enough to cover rent, utilities, and the small comforts that make life bearable. Every paycheck was a reminder that no matter how hard he worked, the system did not reward effort as much as it demanded it. There were nights he went without dinner, saving scraps for his children, refusing to let them shoulder the burden he carried alone. Despite the exhaustion, Jamal's love for his children was unwavering. His daughter, Aliyah, had a laugh that could light a room even when the power went out. His son, Malik, possessed a curiosity that was insatiable, asking questions that challenged Jamal to see the world through their eyes. He would read to them late into the night, using stories as shields against a reality that was often harsh and unyielding. The bedtime ritual was a fragile act of magic, transforming an apartment weighed down by bills and fear into a place where dreams could still exist, however fleetingly. Financial strain was a constant companion. Medical bills from his mother's illness had drained what little savings he had managed to accumulate. Car repairs, grocery shortages, and sudden emergencies turned life into a series of battles fought with borrowed courage. Each unexpected expense was a reminder that the world does not pause for those who labor tirelessly and love deeply. And yet, Jamal continued, driven by a devotion to his children and a belief, perhaps stubborn, perhaps naive, that persistence could still bend the harsh contours of life. Even at work he was tested. Supervisors overlooked his dedication, favoring those who spoke louder or had the right connections. Microaggressions were daily, subtle yet cumulative. A dismissive tone, a questioning glance, and an assignment passed over him. He absorbed these slights silently, knowing that confrontation could cost him his job, but each instance left an invisible mark, layering stress upon exhaustion and doubt upon determination. And always, he returned home to his children, carrying the silent weight of injustice alongside the visible burden of responsibility. There were moments, rare but vivid, when he allowed himself to imagine a life without these pressures. He pictured a home with laughter that was not tempered by fear of what might come next, a pantry full enough to share freely, and a neighborhood where the children could play without concern for danger. But these were fleeting dreams, quickly replaced by the reality of past due notices and the sharp edges of bills that arrived like predators at the door. Jamal's struggle was not only financial. Emotionally, the burden was immense. He often wondered if he was failing his children despite his tireless efforts. The fear that one misstep could unravel everything he had worked for haunted him daily. Nights were spent staring at the ceiling, weighing every choice, calculating every expense, and questioning every decision. Sleep was elusive, and when it came, it offered little solace. He dreamed of eviction notices, of empty pantries, of the disappointed faces of the children he loved above all else. Even love had its complications. Relationships faltered under the weight of his responsibilities. Friends drifted away, unable to understand the relentless demands of his life. Jamal had become accustomed to isolation, a lone figure navigating a world that often seemed designed to test endurance beyond measure. Yet he carried on, his dignity intact, a quiet testament to the resilience of those who refused to surrender, even when surrender might be easier. There were moments of grace, however, small lights in the darkness. A neighbor offering a meal, a coworker extending a hand when the machinery broke, a teacher noticing Malik's potential and encouraging it with a rare warmth. These moments reminded Jamal that humanity had not abandoned him entirely, that kindness still existed in small, quiet gestures. But they were fleeting, easily overshadowed by the constant tide of struggle. Through it all, Jamal's identity was inseparable from his role as a father. He had learned that to love meant to sacrifice, to shield, and to endure. Every day he reminded himself that the world could be harsh, but his children deserved security, love, and hope. He became adept at balancing the impossible, working long shifts while maintaining patience, managing dwindling finances while preserving dignity, and carrying the weight of systemic injustice while providing the scaffolding of hope for two small lives. In these years, Jamal had become a master of quiet resilience. His exterior bore little trace of the storms inside. He smiled for the children, laughed when possible, and masked exhaustion behind polite nods and soft words. The world often judged him by what it could see: a man working a low-wage job, living in modest surroundings, burdened by responsibilities beyond his age. What it could not see was the relentless devotion, the unwavering determination, the sleepless nights filled with worry, and the fierce love that defined every choice he made. And yet, even the strongest resolve has its breaking point. When the eviction notice arrived, it was not just paper, it was a symbol of all the battles fought and seemingly lost. It represented the culmination of years of struggle, the reminder that despite tireless effort, life could still demand more than he had to give. Jamal's shoulders sagged beneath the invisible weight, his hands trembling as he touched the papers that threatened to dismantle everything he had worked for. But even in the face of such adversity, there remained a spark, small, flickering, almost imperceptible. It was a spark born of love, of responsibility, of the belief that the world had not finished testing him yet. That spark would carry him forward, even as despair whispered at the edges of consciousness. And soon, that spark would meet a force unexpected and powerful, one that would challenge every assumption Jamal had made about who could help and how salvation could arrive. For now, he remained in the quiet of his apartment, surrounded by reminders of struggle and sacrifice. Each breath, each heartbeat, each step forward was a small act of courage, a defiance of circumstances determined to overwhelm him. He had endured before. He could endure again. And though hope seemed fragile, it had not been extinguished entirely. The night outside Jamal's apartment was alive with the hum of the city, a world moving in indifferent rhythm while his small space seemed suspended in quiet despair. Then, far down the street, a different sound began to emerge, subtle at first, a low, rolling rumble that threaded through the city noise, almost like a heartbeat in the darkness. It grew steadily, engines reverberating through the asphalt, a rhythm both intimidating and strangely comforting. They were the Iron Roses, a group of bikers whose reputation often preceded them. Known by the city as rough, unyielding, and even dangerous, their presence in any neighborhood stirred whispers and wary glances. But beneath the leather, tattoos, and thunderous engines lay hearts that had learned compassion through lives lived on the margins. They were guardians in a world that often mistook exterior toughness for cruelty, protectors who understood the unspoken struggles of those overlooked. As their motorcycles approached Jamal's block, the night seemed to shift. Streetlights flickered against chrome and leather. Shadows stretched long and confident, yet there was a deliberate gentleness in their formation. No sirens, no aggression, just a presence, a quiet signal that some unseen balance was about to enter his world. From their vantage point, the bikers could see the small apartment, the faint glow of a television illuminating the window where Jamal's children moved about, small figures weighed down by circumstance. The men slowed their bikes, the rumble softening into a steady purr, engines idling in the quiet street. They noticed the father through the window, hunched over a table, a solitary figure burdened by the impossible. The leader, Maverick, a man with weathered features and eyes that had seen both brutality and beauty, recognized the signs immediately. There was no pretense needed. The posture, the gestures, the weight of invisible worry, all of it spoke clearly. Jamal's struggle was raw, exposed, and urgent. And in that moment, it became the biker's responsibility, not out of obligation, but out of an unspoken code that had carried them through countless nights and countless stories of overlooked pain. They did not approach with harsh words or bluster. There was no need. Instead, they circled slowly, engines creating a protective sound barrier, a signal to the neighborhood that something important was unfolding. The city's usual din seemed to soften around them as if aware of the shift, giving space for a different kind of power, the power of kindness paired with strength. One of the younger bikers noticed a pair of small children through the apartment window, their faces tense, their movements hesitant. The sight was enough to solidify what Maverick had already felt. This was not a story of mischief or rebellion, it was a story of survival under relentless pressure. And sometimes, survival needs intervention from those who are willing to stand where others retreat. As they parked along the curb, their presence seemed to draw the apartment into a quieter space, a pause in time where the impossible could start to feel possible. The bikers removed their helmets, revealing faces that, despite tattoos and scars, carried warmth, attention, and empathy. Their movements were deliberate, careful not to startle, but confident enough to assert that they had noticed the wrongs that had gone unseen for far too long. Maverick's gaze lingered on Jamal, noting the slump of his shoulders, the tension in his hands, and the exhaustion that no amount of sleep could erase. There was no judgment, only recognition, a silent acknowledgement that he had been struggling alone and that the weight he carried was both extraordinary and unfair. The biker's actions were small, almost ritualistic in their gentleness. One left a bag near the curb containing essentials, a gesture of recognition, not intrusion. Another leaned against a bike, observing, waiting for the right moment to intervene, knowing that timing mattered as much as strength. They did not rush. They did not speak. They allowed the father's world to exist in its current state, while simultaneously signaling that the tide of despair was about to meet an unexpected ally. Even the rumble of their engines carried meaning now, a sound that was no longer threatening but protective, a heartbeat in rhythm with the city's pulse yet attuned to those it had overlooked. The night itself seemed to respond, shadows receding from windows, lights flickering in acknowledgement of the subtle shift. Through the window, Jamal remained unaware of the watchers, yet the narrative of his struggle was already intersecting with theirs. The bikers, with all their reputation for toughness, had recognized the truth, that sometimes the most vulnerable need the fiercest protectors. And in the quiet, deliberate way that only those accustomed to hardship can operate, they began the process of moving toward intervention, of preparing to tilt the balance of his life, of transforming fear into hope without a single word spoken. This was not heroism in the dramatic, cinematic sense. It was quiet, purposeful, human, a kind of empathy honed by experience, by lives lived close to the edge, by the understanding that appearances often deceive. Jamal's struggle, visible only to those willing to look beyond the surface, had been noticed. And in that recognition, the first seeds of hope were planted, subtle and fragile, yet potent enough to begin shifting the course of events. The city continued to hum, unaware of the change taking place on this one quiet block. Jamal's world was about to meet the extraordinary, a group defined by loyalty, courage, and compassion. In the days to come, what began as a silent observation would bloom into active support, a bridge between despair and possibility. And in that moment, the story poised on the edge of transformation, the narrative shifted ever so slightly. The rumble of motorcycles faded into the night, leaving behind a subtle promise, that when the world turns a blind eye, unexpected kindness can arrive in forms that challenge every assumption, that protect and that heal. The stage was set. The calm before action carried a weight all its own. Jamal remained unaware, yet the world around him had begun to change, and with it, the glimmer of hope had begun to pierce the darkness. The morning brought no relief. The city outside Jamal's apartment pulsed with life, indifferent to the quiet storm unfolding within these walls. The eviction notice on the table remained, a silent predator circling patiently, marking time until it could claim its prey. It was not the first challenge he had faced, but it was the most immediate, the most urgent, and perhaps the most terrifying. The landlord, a man known more for his sharp temper than any semblance of compassion, had already begun his campaign of intimidation. Letters had come first, formal and cold. Then came the phone calls, short, clipped sentences laced with accusation, insinuation, and threat. The final visit, unannounced, had made clear the depth of his impatience and his willingness to exploit fear. Jamal had hoped for understanding or at least delay, but the world rarely offered mercy to those already struggling. The papers on the table symbolized more than just debt. They were the culmination of a lifetime of inequities, of systemic pressures, of invisible battles fought silently in neighborhoods and workplaces alike. Each notice bore the quiet weight of judgment, the subtle accusation that Jamal had somehow failed, that his efforts were insufficient. Yet he had done everything within his power, every extra shift, every skipped meal, every sacrifice, only to confront the harsh reality that good intentions do not always equate to survival. Outside his apartment, shadows shifted as figures arrived. Men and women drawn by the authority of power and the assumption that fear would ensure compliance. They carried clipboards, legal documents, and the confidence of those accustomed to control. Their presence was designed to dominate, to remind Jamal that his position was precarious, that the walls around him were not his own. The tension in the room thickened, palpable and suffocating, as they prepared to enforce consequences that he had spent a lifetime trying to avoid. The confrontation began without ceremony. The landlord's representatives moved through the apartment with calculated authority, their eyes scanning for evidence of negligence or lack of effort. Every object, every corner, every small imperfection was noted, catalogued, and interpreted as a sign of failure. The apartment, which had been a sanctuary despite its limitations, was transformed into a courtroom of silent judgment. Jamal remained in the center, the weight of responsibility pressing down with unrelenting force. Every step he took, every gesture was scrutinized. His life, his love for his children, his tireless work ethic, all of it condensed into a single narrative, insufficient. The antagonist did not care for context, for sacrifice, or for the unrelenting struggle that had defined his life. They cared only for outcome, for the rigid measure of compliance, for the cold certainty of their own authority. The children moved quietly in the background, absorbing the tension, sensing the threat to their home. Even in their innocence, they understood that their father was under siege, and the air of fear settled over them like a shadow too heavy for their small shoulders. Every glance at Jamal carried silent questions. Could he protect them? Would the home they knew and loved be taken away? The weight of these unspoken worries pressed on him even more than the official threat itself. The landlord's voice, sharp and unwavering, cut through the room, each word a calculated strike. The deadlines, the fines, the legal repercussions, all articulated with the precision of someone who believed in the righteousness of their authority. There was no consideration for human frailty, no acknowledgement of effort, and no empathy for the emotional cost of hardship. The room vibrated with a tension that was nearly tangible, a pressure that threatened to crush resolve under the sheer force of institutional power. Jamal tried to navigate the confrontation carefully, explaining, justifying, and detailing every effort he had made to meet obligations. He laid out long hours, financial sacrifices, medical emergencies, and the love that drove every choice he had ever made. Yet his words seemed to vanish into the air, absorbed by the indifferent walls, unnoticed by the faces trained to see only deficiency and failure. Every explanation, every plea, seemed to strengthen the antagonist's resolve rather than soften it, leaving him more exposed, more vulnerable. Time stretched, each moment punctuated by the quiet weight of judgment. Papers shuffled, fingers tapped, eyes narrowed. The subtle, silent threat of eviction, of instability, of the destruction of everything he had worked to protect, hovered like a storm cloud ready to break. It was not the threat alone that terrorized, it was the absolute certainty that the system had no pause for humanity, no space for struggle, and no patience for those who simply could not keep up despite their best efforts. In the midst of this, Jamal's physical and emotional exhaustion became impossible to disguise. His shoulders sagged further under the invisible burden. His gaze flickered toward the children, their small figures huddled together, absorbing the tension of the adults in the room. Their innocence, their hope, and their reliance on him as the center of their universe added another layer of pressure, a reminder that failure was not just personal but generational. The antagonists pushed further, testing boundaries, pressing for compliance, and demanding concessions that were impossible without sacrifice beyond reason. Each demand chipped away at the walls Jamal had built to contain fear and maintain dignity. It was a test of endurance, an unspoken trial to see how much a person could withstand before breaking. And in that moment, the narrative of struggle and perseverance intersected with the narrative of injustice in a way that felt almost cinematic in its cruelty. Jamal was isolated, exposed, and surrounded by the machinery of authority that recognized no human complexity. The story of his life, the hours of labor, the sacrifices made, the love for his children, was invisible to those who had arrived to enforce consequence rather than understand context. Yet even in this moment of escalating tension, there was an undercurrent of something different, something approaching from outside the immediate frame. Beyond the walls of the apartment, beyond the eyes of the antagonists, a presence lingered in the shadows. The distant echo of engines, the quiet rumble that had first announced itself the night before, now drew closer with deliberate persistence. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to those immersed in their authority, but it carried a promise. That intervention, which is justice measured in human empathy rather than cold procedure, was on its way. The storm inside the apartment had reached its crescendo, a tableau of despair, fear, and systemic pressure. Yet the world outside had not forgotten that even in the harshest moments, there are forces willing to challenge cruelty with kindness, to stand where others turn away, and to confront injustice not with rage but with unwavering support. The tension, while suffocating, was the precursor to a shift that would soon redefine the story entirely. Jamal remained in the center of the room, his life on the line, his children watching silently, the antagonists pressing closer, unaware that the narrative was about to pivot. The weight of the world was heavy, but it would not remain unchallenged. Somewhere in the approaching rumble, in the careful, deliberate steps of those who had been trained by hardship themselves, the first movement toward rescue was already underway. The conflict had reached its peak. The stakes were clear. And the narrative was poised on the edge of transformation. Jamal, surrounded by the instruments of injustice, was about to discover that courage and compassion sometimes arrive in the form of the unexpected, that strength often wears the face of those society misjudges, and that no storm, no matter how fierce, is insurmountable when human hearts choose to act. The storm that had gathered over Jamal's life did not dissipate quietly. It roared inside his small apartment, a pressure that seemed insurmountable, a weight that threatened to crush hope itself. And yet, beyond the walls, beyond the noise of judgment and threat, the rumble of engines grew louder, stronger, a heartbeat of resilience approaching with deliberate purpose. The Iron Roses had arrived, not as intruders, not as saviors in the cinematic sense, but as human beings who understood, without judgment, the necessity of stepping in when others failed. Their leader, Maverick, had seen many struggles in his time, but there was a clarity in Jamal's situation that demanded action. The subtle signs, the tension etched into his posture, the weariness that refused to hide, the quiet desperation in the room, spoke volumes. The children, small and attentive, were innocent witnesses to injustice. Their vulnerability stirred something primal in the bikers, a protective instinct that required no words. Without entering immediately, they created a perimeter of presence, the soft purr of engines forming a subtle barrier, signaling a line that others would not cross. The antagonists, absorbed in their bureaucratic enforcement, noticed only the interruption of the outside sound, unaware that the balance of power had already begun to shift. The bikers' approach was deliberate, methodical, and tempered with care, as though they understood that real intervention required precision, patience, and humanity. Inside, Jamal felt the change before he understood its source. The pressure in the apartment, the invisible walls closing in, did not ease, yet there was a shift in the air, a subtle promise of relief, a suggestion that the tide might turn. Hope, fragile and flickering, began to seep back through the cracks of despair. The bikers entered with a quiet authority. They did not shout. They did not demand attention. Their presence alone was a statement, a declaration that cruelty would not go unchallenged, that compassion could occupy the same space as strength, and that those who bore the burden of life unjustly would not bear it alone. Maverick's gaze swept the room, taking in every detail, the small children huddled in the corner, the papers of threat on the table, the invisible toll of stress etched into Jamal's posture. Each detail mattered, Each observation guided the bikers' actions. They began to move, not recklessly but with care, creating space for safety, removing barriers where possible, and signaling through presence that Jamal's life was no longer defined solely by fear. They began small, almost imperceptible gestures of support. A bag of groceries appeared, placed gently near the table, full enough to feed the children without ceremony. Bottled water, milk, fresh bread, these were tokens of human kindness that spoke louder than words. The subtlety of the gestures was intentional, not to overwhelm but to restore dignity, to remind a father burdened by the weight of survival that he was not alone. The antagonists attempted to assert authority, their voices sharp, their demands relentless. Yet the bikers did not argue. Their presence alone commanded respect, not through intimidation but through moral weight. They stood firm, silent but resolute, a barrier between injustice and vulnerability. The room, once tense and oppressive, began to breathe. The children, sensing the shift, allowed their shoulders to relax, their small hands unclenching from invisible grips of fear. As the bikers moved through the apartment, they performed acts that were as practical as they were symbolic. They repaired what could be repaired in the moment. A flickering light replaced, a broken hinge adjusted, and the little apartment made functional and cared for. These were not grand gestures, but in their quiet, meticulous attention lay a declaration. Life mattered, people mattered, and small acts of care could restore more than a room, they could restore hope. Maverick approached the pile of eviction notices, scanning the documents with an experienced eye. Every bureaucratic detail mattered, but it was not the paper alone that concerned him, it was the human story behind it. He made careful notes and spoke in soft tones to the antagonists, challenging assumptions with calm authority. He reminded them, without raising his voice, that what they were enforcing was not merely procedure but a disruption of life, a dismantling of safety for innocent children. The effect was subtle yet profound. Authority met accountability, and a balance began to shift in favor of empathy. In the midst of these actions, there were moments of quiet, tender humanity. A biker knelt to adjust Malik's backpack, noticing the boy's anxious grip on its straps. Another offered a small snack to Aaliyah, who accepted with wide-eyed wonder, too timid at first to believe that strangers could act out of pure care. Each gesture reinforced the underlying message: the world need not be cruel, and sometimes protection arrives from those least expected. The bikers' influence extended beyond immediate aid. They imparted a subtle education in resilience, demonstrating through action that fear could be met with courage, vulnerability met with support, and hopelessness met with human connection. Jamal watched, initially unsure, as these outsiders, often judged harshly by the world, became pillars of strength. Their actions were neither performative nor loud. They were precise, intentional, and grounded in lived experience and understanding. Hours passed in quiet rhythm. Papers were organized, food was set, and spaces were tidied. Conversations were muted, not because communication was unnecessary, but because actions carried a weight words could not match. Jamal observed, absorbing the gestures, internalizing the support. The children played cautiously nearby, their laughter a soft thread weaving hope into the room. For the first time in weeks, Jamal allowed himself a small measure of relief, a sense that the weight of impending loss could be met with the combined strength of those willing to stand beside him. Maverick spoke softly to the antagonists once more, negotiating delays, providing guidance, and creating a path for Jamal to regain footing. The intimidation of bureaucracy began to crumble under the quiet insistence of humanity. Rules mattered, but human dignity mattered more. The room, once heavy with tension, became a space of possibility, a crucible where despair was met with compassion and fear met with courage. The bikers' final gestures were both practical and symbolic. They left behind essentials, instructions for assistance, and a presence that could be called upon if needed. More than that, they left behind the unspoken truth: Jamal's life and the lives of his children was worth protecting. That recognition, delivered through action rather than words, became the cornerstone of transformation. By the end of the day, the apartment had shifted, not in structure alone but in atmosphere. What had once been a place of silent dread became a haven of cautious hope. The children, now reassured, began to speak, to smile, and to reclaim a sense of safety. Jamal, observing quietly, felt the stirrings of something long dormant, belief that the impossible might still be overcome, that support could come in forms unanticipated, and that love and kindness could exist in the world even when it seemed absent. The bikers departed as silently as they had arrived, engines rumbling gently, leaving behind a quiet imprint of compassion. Their intervention was not for recognition, but for the simple, profound act of standing beside those who had been left alone. The room remained, now infused with warmth, practical support, and renewed hope. The narrative of despair had been interrupted by the narrative of human kindness, creating a story that would linger in the hearts of Jamal and his children for years to come. And in that lingering presence, the moral became clear. Sometimes salvation does not come from the expected channels. Sometimes, those who are judged harshly by the world carry the greatest capacity for empathy. And sometimes, when despair threatens to consume life entirely, intervention, quiet, deliberate, unwavering, can remind a father and his children that they are not alone and that hope, no matter how fragile, can be restored. The night fell, but the apartment was no longer shadowed by fear. It glowed with the quiet light of restored possibility, the unspoken promise of continuity, and the knowledge that even in a world fraught with hardship, human kindness could rise to meet the most desperate of circumstances. In this space, Jamal could breathe, the children could play, and life, once threatened by loss, could continue, nurtured by the courage and compassion of those who had chosen to stand when it mattered most. The morning after the intervention carried a quiet stillness, a calm that felt almost foreign to Jamal. The apartment, once heavy with tension and fear, now held a new energy, a subtle warmth that permeated the air, lingering in corners that had long been shadowed by worry. The children moved freely, their laughter cautious but genuine, like sunlight peeking through a sky long clouded. And Jamal, for the first time in weeks, allowed himself to notice. It began with small things. He touched the groceries left behind and realized that someone had cared enough to plan, to prepare, and to ensure that his children would not go hungry. He saw the minor repairs completed in the apartment and understood that someone had moved carefully through his space, not out of obligation but out of genuine concern. Each act, quiet and deliberate, began to chip away at the fortress of despair that he had built around himself. Jamal's thoughts drifted to the bikers, to their presence that had seemed at once intimidating and profoundly reassuring. He realized that strength did not always roar. Sometimes, it arrived quietly, through steadfast attention and unspoken promise. The iron roses had stood where the world had turned away, had acted where others had hesitated, and had reminded him of a truth he had almost forgotten. He did not have to bear life's burdens alone. In the children's laughter, Jamal felt a reflection of himself he had not seen in weeks. Their joy was no longer tentative, it was a mirror of renewed hope. He realized that by caring for them he was not just preserving their present, he was laying the foundation for their future, and that foundation could be stronger than he had dared to imagine. The interventions of the bikers had not just repaired walls and filled cupboards. They had rebuilt faith and had rekindled the belief that perseverance could meet compassion and that love could coexist with strength. Jamal began to notice patterns in his own responses that had gone unexamined. The tension in his shoulders, the constant calculation of every move, the fear that one wrong decision could unravel everything. These had been chains forged in isolation. Now, with the evidence of support surrounding him, he recognized that those chains could be loosened. Care, both given and received, could be a source of strength rather than dependency. The bikers had not done the work for him. They had shown him that he was capable of continuing, that the weight of the world could be managed when human hearts chose to act in solidarity. He took small steps toward reclaiming agency. The papers on the table, once symbols of helplessness, became items to organize, to plan around, rather than forces to fear. The phone calls from the landlord, once sources of dread, were now met with deliberate clarity. Jamal approached each problem with a newfound steadiness, a quiet courage reinforced by the realization that intervention and support were available when needed and that asking for help was not weakness but wisdom. The children became participants in this transformation. Malik's curiosity was nurtured openly, no longer shadowed by the fear of instability. Aaliyah's laughter grew freer and less cautious, and in her eyes, Jamal saw reflected the possibility of a life not defined by constant struggle. Together they moved through the apartment with a sense of reclaimed space, a testament to the subtle yet profound impact of human kindness when paired with action. Jamal also found himself reflecting on the bikers' methods. They had acted without fanfare, with attention to both practicality and dignity. He internalized this lesson, that true strength is often quiet, that true heroism is measured not in noise, but in the deliberate, careful acts that restore possibility. Their intervention had not erased the challenges he faced, but it had given him a framework to navigate them with renewed confidence. Emotionally, Jamal felt a shift that was almost imperceptible at first. The constant undercurrent of anxiety that had defined his days began to loosen. Nights were still long and responsibilities remained, but they were now met with a tempered courage, a steady resolve reinforced by the knowledge that support existed, that the world could bend toward compassion, and that his efforts were meaningful, even when recognition was delayed. In the quiet moments, watching his children play, feeling the solidity of the apartment, sensing the lingering reassurance left by the bikers, Jamal discovered the essence of transformation. It was not a sudden leap or miraculous solution. It was the accumulation of acts of care, the quiet reinforcement of dignity, and the recognition that human connection could fortify even the most exhausted soul. He began to see himself as a father capable of resilience not only for survival but also for thriving, capable of love unencumbered by constant despair. The transformation extended beyond circumstance. Jamal's mindset shifted, quietly yet irreversibly. He embraced the possibility that setbacks could be met with action rather than fear, that vulnerability could coexist with courage, and that asking for and accepting help was a form of strength. The bikers had shown him, without saying a word, that humanity could still rise to meet hardship, and that when hearts act with empathy, lives can be changed profoundly. By the evening, the apartment no longer felt like a space of quiet oppression but a place infused with renewed purpose. The children's laughter rang with clarity, their energy no longer stifled by fear. Jamal, observing the transformation, felt an emotional clarity he had not experienced in months. He recognized that he had grown not because his challenges had disappeared, but because he had internalized the lesson that hope, when nurtured by care and reinforced by deliberate action, could be sustained even under the heaviest burdens. And in that moment, Jamal understood a truth that would guide him beyond the immediate crisis. The presence of human kindness can catalyze transformation, not only in circumstance but also in spirit. He had been reminded that struggle, when met with solidarity and compassion, could be reframed as resilience. He had been taught that even the strongest hearts need support, and that recognizing that need is itself a profound act of courage. The room, the children, the small apartment, everything bore the marks of quiet intervention, yet more importantly, everything reflected the internal change of a father who had reclaimed a sense of possibility. Jamal was no longer simply a man under siege. He was a father strengthened by experience, emboldened by support, and transformed by human kindness. Hope, once nearly extinguished, now burned steadily. And as he watched his children, free to be children again, Jamal knew that this transformation was permanent, rooted not in circumstance alone but in the internalization of care, courage, and compassion. He was ready to face the world again, not with fear but with the quiet strength that comes when one has been lifted when most vulnerable, and has learned to carry that lift within themselves. The following days carried a rhythm that was different from anything Jamal had known in recent memory. The apartment, once a fortress of tension and uncertainty, now hummed with a quiet energy, a rhythm set by hope rather than fear. The children's laughter was no longer tentative. It rang clear, echoing off walls that had long absorbed worry and fatigue. Even the light seemed different, as if the room itself had been infused with the warmth of human kindness. Jamal moved through his day with a newfound steadiness, a confidence born not of circumstance but of internal transformation. The eviction notice that had once symbolized imminent collapse now seemed less like a verdict and more like a challenge that could be met, managed, and overcome. He had been reminded, in the most profound way, that resilience is nurtured not in isolation, but through human connection, through support that arrives when it is most desperately needed. The bikers had left tangible marks on the apartment. Groceries stocked, minor repairs completed, and reminders of care embedded in the small details of daily life. But the true gift they had given was invisible, a restoration of faith, a demonstration that strength and compassion could coexist, that courage could be quiet yet transformative, and that even in a world that often turns a blind eye, humanity could rise to meet need with dignity. Jamal's children began to reclaim pieces of life that had been overshadowed by fear. Malik, who had been cautious in play, now explored freely, his curiosity unrestrained by the weight of uncertainty. Aaliyah's laughter became a daily soundtrack, no longer muted by the anxiety of a home under threat. Together, they embodied the resilience that comes when love and support converge, when the external pressures of life are met not with abandonment, but with active, deliberate care. One evening, Jamal stood by the window watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The world beyond remained indifferent in many ways, yet he had discovered that indifference could be countered. The bikers' intervention had demonstrated that the right people acting with attention, care, and courage could shift the trajectory of life in meaningful ways. He felt a profound gratitude not only for the help received, but also for the lesson in human dignity and the capacity for change. As he reflected, memories of the past months, of struggle, fear, and relentless responsibility, floated to the surface. The weight he had carried, once seemingly insurmountable, had been tempered by the realization that human connection, when delivered with purpose, could lift burdens beyond what he thought possible. Each moment of despair had been a counterpoint to the acts of kindness he had witnessed, creating a narrative that now balanced fear with hope, struggle with possibility, and isolation with support. Jamal recognized the depth of his own transformation. He had internalized the lesson that help is not shameful, that vulnerability is not weakness, and that courage is amplified, not diminished, by accepting care from those willing to offer it. The bikers had not simply solved his immediate problems. They had given him a framework for enduring the future with dignity, for teaching his children by example that compassion can be as powerful as hard work, and that resilience is born in connection as much as in effort. The days unfolded with a rhythm of small victories. Jamal negotiated with the landlord with newfound clarity, calmly presenting his plan for catching up on payments while ensuring the children's security. The bureaucratic tension that had once loomed like a shadow began to dissipate, replaced by practical steps toward stability. Each interaction reinforced the truth that transformation begins internally, carried outward through deliberate action, and grounded in belief in one's own worth. At home, moments of intimacy with his children deepened. Bedtime stories became more than routine. They were rituals of reassurance and bonding, opportunities to reinforce the idea that the world could be navigated with courage and care. Jamal watched them sleep and felt a profound sense of purpose, a renewed understanding that his role as a father was not simply to survive but to cultivate hope, resilience, and love in the hearts of those who relied on him most. And then came the moment that crystallized everything he had learned. Malik, curious as always, asked about the bikers. His question was simple, but it carried weight. "Dad, why did they help us?" Jamal paused, considering how to convey the lesson he had internalized, the principle that had reshaped his understanding of human interaction. "They helped because they could," he said softly, his voice steady with conviction. "Because sometimes, when the world is unfair, there are people who choose to stand where others step away. They help not for reward but because it's the right thing to do. And that is the kind of strength that really matters." Aaliyah, listening from across the room, tilted her head, her eyes wide. "So, good people can make a difference?" she asked. Jamal nodded, feeling a surge of emotional clarity. "Yes, baby. Good people, even in small ways, even quietly, can change everything." It was in that moment that Jamal realized the full extent of the bikers' gift. They had not merely intervened in his crisis. They had taught him a moral truth that would guide him and his children for the rest of their lives. Compassion, courage, and deliberate action could alter trajectories, restore dignity, and plant seeds of hope even in the harshest circumstances. The weeks continued with stability slowly returning. Bills were managed, routines re-established, and the apartment became a space of life rather than fear. Yet the emotional transformation was deeper than any practical improvement. Jamal's posture, his expressions, the way he interacted with his children, everything carried the imprint of renewed strength, a quiet resilience forged in the crucible of struggle and uplifted by unexpected kindness. In the evenings he often reflected on the bikers' visit, replaying their actions in his mind. It was not their appearances that left the deepest impression, tattoos, leather, and roaring engines, but their attentiveness, their deliberate care, and their refusal to turn away when it would have been easier to do so. They had modeled a principle that now guided him, that true strength lies not in aggression or dominance, but in the willingness to act when others hesitate, in the courage to defend the vulnerable, and in the humility to serve without expectation. The moral extended beyond immediate circumstance. Jamal recognized that life would continue to challenge him, that systemic pressures and daily hardships would not disappear. But he also understood that transformation, real, lasting, and profound, was possible when kindness met action, when hope was reinforced by deliberate support, and when courage and compassion worked in tandem. He had learned that strength was both inherited and cultivated, that resilience could be taught through example, and that one life changed could ripple outward, affecting many more. One evening, he found himself standing outside, listening to the distant rumble of motorcycles fading into the horizon. He smiled quietly, recognizing that the iron roses had left their mark not only on his life but also on the framework of his family's future. Their presence had been temporary, but their impact would endure forever, woven into the lessons he would impart, the love he would cultivate, and the courage he would embody. Jamal returned to the apartment and found Malik building a small tower of blocks, carefully stacking each piece with determination. Aaliyah was drawing, her colors bright and bold, filling the paper with unrestrained imagination. He watched them, feeling the full sweep of emotion, relief, gratitude, hope, and pride. The transformation that had begun with a simple act of kindness had blossomed into a tangible, living reality in his home. And in that quiet, ordinary moment he understood the ultimate truth. Life is often harsh, unfair, and relentless, but humanity, the deliberate, courageous, compassionate action of others, can be a force stronger than despair. It can restore dignity, instill hope, and teach lessons that endure across generations. The bikers had been more than helpers. They had been teachers of moral truth, guardians of possibility, and witnesses to the power of empathy in action. Jamal knelt to embrace his children, holding them tightly, feeling the rhythm of life in their small bodies, and whispered softly, "We are okay. We are safe. And no matter what, we can keep going." The moral of his journey was clear and irrevocable. In a world that can often seem indifferent, it is human kindness, courage, and action that sustain life, restore hope, and transform despair into opportunity. It is in the care we extend, the courage we summon, and the support we offer, especially when it is inconvenient or difficult, that the truest measure of humanity is found. The night settled over the apartment, calm and protective, filled with the quiet echoes of laughter, love, and hope. Jamal knew that the struggle would continue, that life would present new challenges, and that uncertainty would always be a companion. But he also knew something more profound, that he had learned to carry hope within himself, reinforced by the memory of those who had acted when the world had not, and that through compassion and courage lives, his own and those of his children, could be changed forever. The story of a father on the brink of losing everything had shifted into the story of a family restored by human kindness. And in that transformation, the world had whispered its most enduring lesson. Sometimes salvation arrives in unexpected forms, courage and empathy exist where least expected, and the simple acts of those willing to stand beside the vulnerable can create legacies far greater than any hardship endured alone. In the end, the truth was simple yet profound. When hearts choose to act, even the darkest moments can give way to light, even despair can yield hope, and even the most battered soul can rise to embrace a future defined not by fear, but by love, courage, and unwavering humanity.